Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. The marches, protests, and vigils continue a month after the killing of George Floyd. And the conversations are underway at the state level about how to improve law enforcement and racial equity here in New Hampshire. One of the drivers of that conversation is the Black Lives Matter movement. And this morning, we're joined by organizer Ronelle Shella of Manchester. Ronelle, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, Ronelle, as Black Lives Matter has taken on a central role in this cultural moment, what would you say is the biggest misconception your fellow Granite Staters have about Black Lives Matter here in New Hampshire?
A lot of people think that we're not actually from New Hampshire and we've been flown in order to organize protests and vigils and things like that. But the truth is we all grew up in Manchester and we just want to see the state of New Hampshire and the city of Manchester be the best it can be for all people, including Black people and people of color.
So you recently called out Executive Councilor Andrew Volinsky and his fellow Democratic councilors for their treatment of a pair of Black nominees who were nominated for state-level positions. One of those nominees, Eddie Edwards, said after the fact he couldn't get a hearing for 105 days after being nominated, and then that was an example of textbook structural political racism. You agreed and came to his defense, even though you share very few of Mr. Edwards' political beliefs. Explain why.
Yeah, like you said, I do not share any of his political beliefs, but I believe that Black Lives Matter is not a political issue, it's a human rights issue. And if a Black man is being targeted if a Black man is being targeted and has experienced racism, we're going to call it out regardless. And, a lot of people think that liberals and Democrats are exempt from bias, and that's just not the case. So it was necessary for us to say something about it.
Yeah, you mentioned that feeling of exemption that exists out there. Councilor Volinsky apologized and said he wants to engage in a dialogue and also plans to do some self-introspection. I think part of what makes this situation so interesting is he's probably one of the most progressive elected officials in the state, and yet it still took him a matter of weeks to say that he was sorry for using words like unqualified and demeaning when it came to addressing a Black nominee, acknowledging finally the weighted history of using a word like unqualified that has been used to hold Black people back for so long. So was part of you thinking when you heard him saying these things and then not really acknowledging it that you're wondering why is it taking him so long to at least try to hear his words through the ears of a person of color?
Yeah, I did wonder for a while why he wasn't understanding or why he wasn't saying something about the fact that it was wrong. And I think that it's taken us to really push him to do those things, to really come out and say hey, I was wrong, in order for him to realize that it was wrong. And using the words demeaning, tokenism, and unqualified, and when they're not the case, that's just unacceptable, and they do have historically racist sentiments.
And yet you're still getting blowback from people who had identified, who had marched and identified as white allies for taking this stand. They're saying, oh, how can you sell us out? What's your reaction?
Yeah. My reaction to that is they need to take a long look at what they believe being an ally means. A lot of people have been saying Black Lives Matter is a human rights issue. It's not a political issue. And they've been saying the same thing. So my question for them would be, do you truly believe that racial justice is a human rights issue, or is that only when it's convenient for you?
So you're also serving on the newly minted Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability, Community, and Transparency. Things are just getting kicked off this week with a look at police training. From where you stand, is the state starting from a good place at looking at its law enforcement practices?
I believe that a lot of good questions are getting asked. We're really looking at right now the issue of training standards in police departments in New Hampshire. I think, like I said, a lot of great questions are being asked, and we need to continue to ask those questions to really figure out what areas need change and what we can do to make them better.
And the governor has tasked this commission with coming up with action items within the span of just 45 days. The clock's ticking on that. I think we're down to 30-something days now.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think there's a lot of consensus around a ban on chokeholds, and that's moving its way through the legislature. But what else would you like to see come out of this commission?
One of the biggest things that Black Lives Matter has focused on is implicit bias training. That needs to be the standard for every single police department in New Hampshire, and it needs to be extensive implicit bias training, because it's not enough to do an hour or two of training of implicit bias, but it needs to be extensive, and experts need to be doing the training so that it's as effective as possible. Because right now that's just not the case, and that's unacceptable, because that's where a lot of our issues stem from, is them not being able to recognize their bias and choose to act on it a different way.
So what does a good, in your eyes, cultural sensitivity training look like for a police officer?
Well, I believe the instructor of said course would have expertise in this area. I don't think it's enough to have somebody that has just as much knowledge as somebody who's never studied it before, but has just read up on it. I think it needs to be extensive, more than just a couple of hours, because it's not just a couple of hours that they're going to have to deal with something like this. It's a lot. And as long as there's one or two people in whatever town that they're policing in, it needs to be extensive, and they need to have really experts that are able to teach law enforcement to engage in certain scenarios in a different way that they might not otherwise.
What do you think about the issue of representation within police departments? Do you think police departments in New Hampshire should make a greater effort to diversify, or is it going to be hard at this point to find young people of color who want to sign up?
I think that it might be hard, but I don't think that there shouldn't be an effort to try, simply because I know that there are people of color out there that would love to be within the system that they want to change. I don't think right now our police departments reflect our communities, and I think that could definitely bring more different insight and different ideas to the table, and I think that's important, and an effort should be made in that area.
And as you've organized these marches, you've engaged closely with Manchester Police, also police at the state level. What's your kind of gauging of their receptivity to the message that you bring?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm just wondering, as you've worked with Manchester Police, as you've worked with state police in planning these marches and engaging with them, do you think that they're listening? Do you feel like you have connected with people there at the police leadership level?
Within the Manchester Police Department, I do believe that some of them are definitely listening. At the state level, I'm not quite sure yet. I think it's yet to come in that area, and I'll learn more about that while I serve on the commission. But as of right now, I believe that everyone is kind of willing to listen. I think the question is, are we willing to make change after listening?
And there are people out there who, of course, are waiting for you guys to make any kind of mistake. They were eager to tie your peaceful vigils to threats of riot and violence. Oddly enough, it's culturally acceptable for folks on the other side to march around like they're in Fallujah, Iraq, preparing for some kind of armed confrontation. And yet you guys get attacked if there happens to be a pallet of bricks at a construction site blocks away that may be used to break a window. How do you deal with that kind of inequity and the pressure that's on you to be a perfect vessel of your message?
It's hard, especially since I'm only 21 years old, and a lot of people expect us to just be perfect and model citizens, and they expect us to be in charge of every single thing that happens around the city. We had a peaceful vigil in Manchester one night, and that same night, unfortunately, something ensued on South Willow Street that we had nothing to do with and no affiliation with. And unfortunately, people will tie us to that cause. And this is heartening because we work so hard to make sure that our message remains peaceful and to make sure that we're coordinating with leaders who can help us really make change. And I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes, but I don't believe that those mistakes are going to have any affiliation to violence or anything like that. Like you said, people are able to walk around strapped with AR-15s and guns and rifles, but if we were to do that, which we don't, they would take that and say that we're violent and we're wanting to burn down buildings and do all these things and hurt people, and that's just not the case.
So describe for me, as New Hampshire opens its eyes in this moment, how serious of a problem is racism in the Granite State?
I believe it's a huge problem in the Granite State. A lot of people don't see that because New Hampshire is 96% white. And so a lot of people think, hey, there's not many people of color in my community. Maybe it's not an issue. But the truth is, your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers, they're all experiencing racism. They are. Racism exists in New Hampshire. I think it exists in New Hampshire police, and it exists in our communities. New Hampshire's by no means exempt to racism.
And I do want to touch quickly on the pandemic. COVID-19 statistics have shown it's disproportionately affecting people of color. Are you seeing that in your community in Manchester?
I have, yeah, definitely. Among a lot of the adults in Manchester that work at certain places and things like that. And I believe it's definitely tied to healthcare and other things. And there's like a lot of factors that go into it. So unfortunately, it's unfortunate, but it does disproportionately affect people of color. And that is a problem that extends to Manchester, New Hampshire.
So as we look ahead, are you hopeful for the future?
I am hopeful. You know, a few years ago, I might not have said that, but the conversation has continued after a month, and that's something huge, especially for a state like New Hampshire. So I think as long as we keep this conversation going and really keep pushing for change, the change that we want to see here in New Hampshire, I think that in the future we'll definitely see it, and so I'm hopeful.
All right, Ronelle Chella, thank you for joining us on Close Up. I've got a feeling that this won't be the last time we have you on the show.
I hope not.
All right.